Elasticity is a measure of how much buyers and sellers respond to changes in market conditions. When studying how some event or policy affects a market, we can discuss not only the direction of the effects but also their magnitude. Elasticity is useful in many applications as we see towards the end of this chapter. So, the questions we seek to answer are one, what is elasticity? What kinds of issues can elasticity help us understand? What is the price elasticity of demand? How is it related to the demand curve? How is it related to revenue and expenditures? What is the price elasticity of supply? How is it related to supply curve? What is the income and cross price elasticity of demand? Let's look at a typical scenario. You design a website for local business. You charge $200 per website and currently sell 12 websites per month. Your costs are rising, including the opportunity cost of your time. You consider raising the price to $250. The law of demand, you won't sell as many websites as if you raise your price. So how many fewer websites? How much will your revenue fall, or might it increase? So how do we define elasticity? Elasticity is a measure of the responsiveness of quantity demanded or quantity supplied to changes in one of its determinants. Price elasticity of demand is defined as how much the quantity demanded of a good responds to a change in the price of the good. Loosely speaking, it measures the price sensitivity of buyer's demand. Price elasticity of demand is calculated as the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. From this graph, you can see that price rises by 10%. That is what goes on the denominator. And quantity falls by 15%. That is the numerator. And so the price elasticity of demand is 1.5. Along a demand curve, price and quantity move in opposite directions, which would make price elasticity negative, but we will ignore the negative sign. We will drop the minus sign and report all price elasticities as positive numbers. Standard method of computing percentage change is end value minus start value divided by start value times 100. Going from looking at the graph, going from A to B, the percentage change in price, that is 250 minus 200 divided by 200 is 25%. The percentage change in quantity is negative 33%, which is that means the price elasticity is 33 divided by 25, and that's 1.33. Going from B to A, percentage change in price is 20%. Percentage change in quantity is 50%. Price elasticity of demand is price elasticity is 2.5. We get different numbers, and that is frustrating. And we'll talk about that later on. There's going to be a better formula. And that better formula is called the midpoint formula to avoid this scenario. The midpoint is the number halfway between the start and the end value, the average of these values. So percentage change is the end value minus the start value divided by the midpoint. And you multiply that by 100. So price elasticity of demand is Q2 minus Q1, or divided by, in brackets, Q 2 plus Q1 into bracket divide by 2. That's the average. And you divide that by the denominator becomes P2 minus P1, which is the change in price. You divide that by into bracket P2 plus P1 divide by 2, that's the average of price. That is the midpoint formula. So using the midpoint method of computing price elasticity, as we see from the diagram, from the graph, percentage change in price is 250 minus 200 divided by 225. 225 is the average of the 2 points. And you multiply that by 100, gives you 22.2. Percentage change in quantity is 12 minus 8 divided by 10. 10 is the average of these two, and you multiply by 100, that gives you 40. Therefore, price elasticity is 40% divided by 22.2% is 1.8, and that number remains the same whether price is increasing from 200 to 250 or decreasing from 250 to 200. Let's look at active learning 1. Use the following information to calculate the price elasticity of demand for iPhones. If price 400 corresponds to quantity demanded 10,600 and price 600 corresponds to quantity demanded 8,400, use the midpoint method to calculate percentage change. Percentage change in price, of course, 600 minus 400, divide by the average of the two prices, and times 100, that's 40%. Percentage change in quantity is 10,600 minus 8,400. Divide that by the average of the two, is 9,200. You multiply that by 100, the percentage change is 23.16%. Price elasticity of demand is equal to percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price, which is 23.16% divided by 40, and so the price elasticity of demand is 0.58. Determinants of price elasticity of demand. What determines whether consumers respond or don't respond to changes in price? We look at a series of examples comparing two common goods. In each example, suppose prices of both goods rise by 20%. Which good has the highest price elasticity of demand, and why? What lesson we learn about the determinants of price elasticity of demand? Example 1, breakfast cereal versus sunscreen. Prices of both of these goods rise by 20%. For which good does quantity demanded drop the most, and why? Breakfast cereal has close substitutes, so buyers can easily switch if price rises. Sunscreen has no close substitutes, so a price increase would not affect demand very much. Therefore, price elasticity is higher when close substitutes are available. Example 2, blue jeans versus clothing. Price of both of these goods rise by 20%. For which good does quantity demanded drop the most, and why? For a narrowly defined good like blue jeans, there are many substitutes. There are fewer substitutes available for broadly defined goods like clothing. Price elasticity, therefore, is higher for narrowly defined goods than for broadly defined goods. Example 3, insulin versus yachts. Price of both of these goods rise by 20%. For which good does quantity demanded drop most, and why? Insulin is a necessity to diabetics, A rise in price would cause little or no decrease in demand. A yacht is a luxury. If the price rises, some people will forgo it. Therefore, price elasticity is higher for luxuries than for necessities. Example 4, gasoline in the short run versus gasoline in the long run. The price of gasoline rises 20%. Does quantity demanded drop more in the short run or the long run, and why? There is not much people can do in the short run other than ride the bus or carpool. In the long run, people can buy smaller cars or live closer to work. Therefore, price elasticity is higher in the long run. Variety of demand curves. Demand is elastic. That means price elasticity of demand is greater than 1. Demand is inelastic. When the price elasticity of demand is less than 1. Demand has unit elasticity when the price elasticity of demand is equal to 1. Variety of demand curves. Demand is perfectly inelastic. When price elasticity of demand is 0, demand curve is vertical. Demand curve is perfectly elastic when price elasticity of demand is infinity. Demand curve is horizontal. The flatter the demand curve, the greater the price elasticity of demand. Perfectly inelastic demand. Price elasticity of demand, the formula is percentage change in quantity divided by percentage change in price. In this case, the price falls by 10%, that goes to the denominator. The numerator, quantity, changes by 0%. And 0% divided by 10% is 0. Demand curve is vertical, as you can see. Consumer price sensitivity is none, and elasticity, therefore, is 0. Inelastic demand. Price elasticity of demand is equal to percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. Price decreases from P1 to P2, that's a 10% decline. That goes to the horizontal denominator. And price changes from Q1 to Q2, quantity, beg your pardon. Quantity changes from Q1 to Q2, a rise of 10%. Demand is relatively steep, as you can see. Consumer price sensitivity is relatively low. And therefore, elasticity is less than 1. Inelastic. What about unit elastic demand? Unit elastic demand is calculated as price changes from P1 to P2, price falls by 10%, quantity changes from Q1 to Q2, quantity rises by 10%, 10% divided by 10% is equal to 1. Demand curve is intermediate, some midpoint between being steep and being relatively flat, and that we call intermediate slope. Consumer price sensitivity is intermediate, not flat, not steep, and therefore elasticity coefficient is equal to 1. Elastic demand, percentage change in price, price falls by 10%, quantity rises by more than 10%, 11, 12, 20, 30. When the price changes by greater than 10%, over 10%, the elasticity coefficient will be greater than 1. Demand curve, as you can see, is now flat, relatively flat. Consumer price sensitivity is high. Consumers are sensitive to price changes. That is when elasticity coefficient is greater than 1. Perfectly elastic demand. The demand curve is horizontal, so price changes by 0%. Price does not change. And quantity changes by any change in quantity, really. Any change in quantity will be dividing this. Zero is the denominator, and that defines infinity. You change price, and consumers will respond in infinite direction. That means the demand curve is horizontal. Consumer price is very, very sensitive, an extreme case. That is infinity. And that is when elasticity coefficient is infinite or infinity. Few elasticities from the real world. Eggs, elasticities 0.01, that is less than 1 inelastic. Healthcare, 0.2, that is inelastic. Cigarettes, zero point 0.4, that is inelastic, but rising. Rice is 0.5, still less than 1, inelastic, but rising. Housing, 0.7, inelastic. Beef, 1.6, that is greater than 1. The demand for beef is price sensitive. Peanut butter, 1.7 and rising. Restaurant meals, 2.3. Mountain Dew, 4.4. It's greater than 1, and the larger the number, the more sensitive to price changes. Elasticity along a linear demand curve. The slope of a linear demand curve is a constant, but its elasticity is not. Students need to be careful here. Do not confuse the slope of a line with elasticity. In the upper end of the demand curve, demand tends to be elastic. So if price changes from 30 to 20, quantity changes from 0 to 20, elasticity coefficient is 0.5. That is high. That is, demand is greater, elasticity is greater than 1, demand is elastic. Somewhere in the middle of the demand curve, price changing from 20 to $10, and quantity changing from 20 to 40, elasticity is calculated 67% percentage change in quantity divided by 67% percentage change in price is equal to 1. That is unit elastic in the middle of the demand curve. The lower end of the demand curve, the percentage change in quantity, price changing from 0 to 10 and quantity changing from 40 to 60 is 40% divided by 200% is equal to 0.2. So the upper end of the demand curve, demand is elastic. In the middle somewhere, demand is unit elastic. And the lower end of the demand curve, demand is inelastic. Price elasticity and total revenue. Continuing our scenario, if you raise your price from $200 to $250, would your revenue fall? We know that total revenue is price times quantity. A price increase has two effects on revenue. Higher revenue because of the higher price, lower revenue, you sell fewer units. That is lower Q. Which of these two effect is higher? It depends on the price elasticity of demand. For a price increase, if demand is elastic, that means elasticity coefficient is greater than 1, percentage change in quantity is greater than percentage change in price. Total revenue decreases, the fall in revenue from lower quantity is greater than the increase in revenue from higher price. For a price increase, if demand is inelastic, when elasticity coefficient is less than 1, percentage change in quantity is less than percentage change in price. Total revenue increases, the fall in revenue from lower quantity is less than the increase in revenue from higher price. So when demand is price elastic, total revenue and price move in opposite direction. Price goes up, total revenue falls. Price goes down, total revenue rises. When demand is inelastic, there is a direct relationship between total revenue and price. Price goes up, total revenue goes up. Price goes down, total revenue goes down. Demand for your website. Elastic demand. When demand is elastic, that means elasticity coefficient is equal to 1.8. If price is 200 and quantity is 12 and revenue is 2400, that is 200 times 12, and price increases to 250 and quantity falls to 8 and revenue is 2000. Lost revenue due to lower price is the blue area, and the green area increase in revenue due to higher price. When demand is elastic, price increase causes revenue to fall. Price goes up, revenue goes down. Demand for your website, inelastic demand. When demand is inelastic and elasticity coefficient is less than 1, in this case is 0.82. Same example, price, start out with price equal to 200 and quantity is 12, revenue is 2200. If we raise the price to 250, quantity falls to 10 and revenue goes up to 25. What happens here? The lost revenue due to quantity, lower quantity, is the blue area. And increase in revenue due to price is the green area. When demand is inelastic, price increase causes revenue to rise. Same direction, price goes up, revenue goes up. Active learning. Number A, pharmacies raise the price of insulin by 10%. Does total revenue on insulin rise or fall? Number B, as a result of a fair war, the price of luxury cruises falls 20%. Does luxury cruise companies' total revenue rise or fall? Answer number A, pharmacies raise the price of insulin by 10%. Does total expenditure on insulin rise or fall? Expenditure or revenue is price times quantity. Since demand is inelastic, quantity will fall by less than 10%, so expenditure rises. Remember, when demand is inelastic, a rise in price will lead to a rise in total revenue. Number B, as a result of fair war, the price of luxury cruise falls 20%. Does luxury cruise companies' total revenue rise or fall? We know that when demand is elastic, revenue and price move in opposite direction. So the fall in price reduces revenue, but quantity increases, which increases revenue. Which effect is bigger? Since demand is elastic, quantity will increase more than 20%, so revenue will rise. Does drug interdiction increase or decrease drug-related crime? Number one, increase the number of federal agents, increase in the number of federal agents devoted to war on drugs. Illegal drugs supply curve shifts left. Higher price and lower quantity will result. Amount of drug-related crimes are inelastic demand for drugs, higher drug prices, higher total revenue, increased drug-related crime. Interdiction. Initial value of drug-related crimes is this orange area. Interdiction reduces the supply of drugs, shifting the supply curve from S1 to S2. Demand for drugs is inelastic, so price rises proportionally more than quantity. You see that the new value of drug-related crime is the green area. Result, an increase in total spending on drugs and in drug-related crime. Does drug interdiction increase or decrease drug-related crime? Number two, policy of drug education. Reduce demand for illegal drugs. Left shift of demand curve. Lower quantity, lower price, reduce drug-related crime. So let's see the effect of education using the demand and supply curve. Take the initial drug-related crime. Education reduces demand for drugs. Fewer people are buying the drugs. Demand shifts to the left from D1 to D2. Price will fall and quantity will fall. Price goes from Q1 to Q2. Quantity falls from Q1 to Q2. New value of drug-related crimes. The result is a decrease in total spending on drugs and in drug-related crime. Price elasticity of supply. Price elasticity of supply is how much the quantity supplied of a good responds to a change in the price of that good. Percentage change in quantity supplied divided by percentage change in the price. That's the formula for calculating price elasticity of supply. Loosely speaking, it measures the seller's price sensitivity. So looking at a typical supply curve, if price rises from P1 to P2, quantity will rise from Q1 to Q2. Using the price elasticity formula, so price elasticity of supply, percentage change in quantity supplied, divided by percentage change in price. So if quantity supplied goes up by 16%, that is the numerator, and the denominator, price rises by 8%, the elasticity coefficient is 2. We use the midpoint formula to compute percentage change. As we have seen in the past, midpoint formula is a more reliable formula. Variety of supply curves. Supply is unit elastic when price elasticity of supply is equal to 1. Supply is elastic when price elasticity of supply is greater than 1. Supply is inelastic when price elasticity of supply is less than 1. Supply is perfectly inelastic when price elasticity of supply is equal to 0. Supply curve is vertical. Supply is perfectly elastic when price elasticity of supply is equal to infinity. Supply curve is horizontal. The flatter the supply curve, the greater the price elasticity of supply. Let's look at some diagrams. So here is a perfectly inelastic supply, vertical supply curve. If we calculate the price elasticity of supply, we look at price going from P1 to P2, a 10% increase in price, that goes to the denominator of the formula. Price changing by 0. The supply curve is vertical. Therefore, quantity supplied does not change. That change or 0% goes to the top, and that answer is 0. So when the supply curve is vertical, seller's price sensitivity is none, and elasticity coefficient is 0. What about inelastic supply? Okay, using the elasticity formula, we can see that when a price change from P1 to P2, price goes up by 10%, quantity quantity changes by 10% or by rises less than 10%. As you can see, a change in quantity is smaller than a change in price. So it's a number less than 10% divided by 10 will give us a number less than 1. So supply curve is relatively steep. When the supply curve is relatively steep, seller's price sensitivity is relatively low. So we say supply is inelastic or relatively inelastic. And the elasticity coefficient is less than 1. What about unit elastic? Using the formula, we can see that a change in price, 10%, divided by a change in quantity, 10%. When the change in price is equal to a change in quantity, that is equal to 1. We call that unit elastic. Supply curve is an intermediate slope. It is neither steep nor flat. It originates right from the origin, and that is what we call intermediate slope. Seller's price sensitivity is intermediate, and elasticity coefficient is equal to 1. Elastic supply, we calculate elastic supply with the same change in price change by 10%, but quantity changing from Q1 to Q2 changes by a number greater than 10%. And when a number greater than 10% goes to in this formula, the result is a number that is greater than 1. And that means supply is relatively flat. This line is relatively flat. Seller's price sensitivity is high or elastic. Sellers are sensitive to price changes. And elasticity is greater than 1. What about perfectly elastic supply? When supply is perfectly elastic, supply curve is horizontal. That means that there's no change in price. The price change is 0. And when the price change is 0, it does not matter the change in quantity. If any quantity change divided by 0% is going to give you an infinity. That means supply curve is horizontal. The seller's price sensitivity are extreme, infinite response, at least theoretically, and elasticity is infinity. Determinants of supply elasticity. Greater price elasticity of supply. The greater the price elasticity of supply, the more easily sellers can change the quantity they produce. Supply of beachfront property, harder to vary and thus less elastic than supply of new cars. Price elasticity of supply is greater in the long run than in the short run. In the long run, farms can build new factories or new farms may be able to enter the market. Active learning 3, elasticity and changes in equilibrium. The supply of beachfront property is inelastic. The supply of new cars is elastic. Suppose population growth causes demand of both goods to double. At each price, quantity demanded doubles. For which product will price change the most? And for which product will quantity change the most? Answer. When supply is inelastic, an increase in demand has a bigger impact on price than on quantity, as we can see on the graph for beachfront property. And price changing from P1 to P2, quantity changing from Q2 to Q1. When supply is elastic, when supply is relatively flat, an increase in demand has a bigger impact on quantity than on price. As you can see, demand increasing from D1 to D2 and price changing from P1 to P2, quantity changes by a bigger magnitude, elastic supply. How price elasticity of supply can vary. Elasticity is large, greater than 1. Supply often becomes less elastic as quantity rises due to capacity limits. At lower prices, supply tends to be flatter or more elastic. At higher prices, we tend to reach close to capacity, and therefore a change in price will have a relatively small change in quantity. Other elasticities of demand. Income elasticity of demand. Instead of changing the price, now we change income and hold price constant. Income elasticity of demand is how much the quantity demanded of a good responds to a change in consumer income. So you change the consumer income and you see how quantity demanded change. The formula is percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in income. For a normal good, the income elasticity coefficient will be a number that is positive, a number greater than 0. For an inferior good, income elasticity will be a number that is negative, a number that is less than 0. For gross price elasticity of demand, how much quantity demanded of one good responds to a change in the price of another good. The formula for calculating gross price elasticity of demand is percentage change in quantity demanded of the first good divided by percentage change in the price of the second good. If the two goods are substitutes, the gross price elasticity coefficient will be a positive number, a number greater than 0. If the two goods are complements, the gross price elasticity of demand will be a negative number less than 0. Let's look at some applications. Can good news for farming be bad news for farmers? New hybrid of wheat increase production per acre by 20%. Supply curve shifts to the right, higher quantity and lower price. Demand is inelastic, total revenue falls. That is the bad news for farmers. If the good news for farming, that means some farmers increase their production, but then their revenue falls because the demand is inelastic. The paradox of public policy induces farmers not to plant. Sometimes you find the government paying the farmers not to plant. We call that farm subsidy. That's a paradox right there. An increase in supply in the market for wheat. When supply shifts to the right, demand is inelastic. Because when demand is inelastic and supply shifts to the right, an increase in supply, that leads to a large fall in price. Price goes, in this example, from 3 to 2, and a proportionate smaller increase in quantity sold. As a result, revenue falls from 300 to 200. So when demand is inelastic, an increase in supply will lead to smaller revenue or revenue falling. Another application: why did OPEC fail to keep the price of oil high? Increase in prices in 1973-74 and 1971 to 1981. In the short run, supply and demand are relatively inelastic. A decrease in supply will lead to large increase in price. In the long run, supply and demand are elastic. A decrease in supply will lead to a small increase in price. OPEC could raise their revenue in the short run when supply and demand are inelastic, but in the long run, when both are elastic, they cannot sustain that higher profit. A reduction in supply in the world oil market. The oil market in the short run looks like this in the diagram. In the short run, when supply and demand are inelastic, a shift in supply will lead to a large increase in price. OPEC countries make a lot of money at that point. In the long run, when demand and supply are both elastic, you can see demand is fairly flat and supply is fairly flat. When they continue to increase supply, or they tend to decrease supply, in the long run, when supply and demand are elastic, a shift in supply will lead to a small increase in price. So even if OPEC tries to cut the supply to raise their revenue, it is too late. The increase is little because the demand and supply are elastic. In summary, elasticity measures the responsiveness of quantity demanded or quantity supplied to one of its determinants. Price elasticity of demand equals percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. When it's less than 1, demand is inelastic. When elasticity coefficient is greater than 1, demand is elastic. When demand is inelastic, total revenue rises when price falls. The income elasticity of demand measures how much quantity demanded responds to changes in buyer's income. The cross price elasticity of demand measures how much demand for one good responds to changes in the price of another good. The tools of supply and demand can be applied in many different kinds of markets. This chapter uses them to analyze the market for wheat, the market for oil, and the market for illegal drugs. We'll look at chapter 6 next.